Hi, everyone. So I wanted to begin with a small pause because after the attack on the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, it would be unfathomable to just launch into some learning. And what I also wanted to do is draw a context before the teaching begins, because there are many who are responding to the attack on a synagogue where 11 Jews were murdered in cold blood by a gunman. They're seeing it primarily through the lens of anti-Semitism, and of course, how else would a Jew see it? Especially given our history, especially given the trauma of the Holocaust, especially given our awareness of Jewish vulnerability, how could we not see it? As the number of anti-Semitic incidents in America grows by leaps and bounds over these last years, and as hate rhetoric begins to fill the American airwaves and the digital spheres more and more with the permission, if not endorsement, of our president and the government, there is a lot to say when it comes to Jewish vulnerability in this moment. But what is also important to do is to hold this and to see it in the context of an American gun violence epidemic. Both are true. It is true that 96 people are shot and killed in America by guns every day. It is true that the vast majority of them never get reported because they aren't mass shootings of white people. It is also important to recognize that in the last 3 years, there have been 12 massacres in houses of faith, let alone the school shootings, let alone urban gun violence, let alone the suicides through firearms that never should be found in the hands of those who are depressed and should not have access to guns, given their mental state of being. And so on the one hand, as a Jew, how can we experience this as anything other than anti-Semitism? On the other hand, we dare not see ourselves as isolated because America is a place where ghettos can be self-imposed just as they can be imposed from the outside. And so whereas there is an increase in anti-Semitism in America that should never be denied, it is also important to recognize that a Sikh temple was attacked and people were murdered. It is true that the AME Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston was also targeted and 9 people were murdered. We are part of an American fabric where faith is not a protection per se. Schools, theaters, clubs, the street. So does this hit more? Yeah, because it was a Jewish prayer book, a Siddur that was bloodied. Does this hurt more? Of course. Those are my brothers and sisters and grandparents. Does it hurt more? Of course, because that's my language of prayer. Does it hurt differently than it would were I a Sikh whose temple was attacked, a Muslim whose mosque is attacked, a Christian whose church is attacked, an atheist whose streets are violated? It shouldn't hurt more. Of course it does, and we're part of a larger society where this is happening, where because of the political nature of money and because of the defenselessness, it seems, of politicians to the agenda of the NRA and to the extremism that seems to be finding more of a foothold in today's American rhetoric, including the endorsement of a president who seems to celebrate violence and endorse strong tactics as opposed to compassion and nobility and civility. This is a moment of coming together, but that doesn't mean that guns should be on our streets and that assault rifles should be available. This doesn't mean we should be paralyzed as a legislative system, because if in truth every moment where there is a gun violence death is not the moment to get political, then there is literally not a day of the year where we can say a word. And so even though there are 33,000 gun violence deaths in America every year, 96 gun violence deaths a day, and the 11 Jews that were murdered in cold blood while worshiping by someone who worshipped bullets more than human beings, by someone who attacked Jews because it is a Jewish value to welcome the stranger, and among the Jewish values that we exercise with incredible passion is the commitment to social justice and to find refuge for refugees. A caravan is not terrorism. A gunman coming into a synagogue is a terrorist. And to not call out the white supremacy and the extremist rhetoric that is absolutely engendered by today's political system is to abdicate our responsibility as moral human beings and as of Americans who care for each other. And from a Jewish standpoint, it forgets the teaching that is best codified by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who said that an act of violence is an act of desecration. To be arrogant toward a person is to be blasphemous toward God. That's the Jewish response. That is always the Jewish response to gun violence. That is always the Jewish response to violence. Not to arm ourselves, presuming that it is anything other than a deterrent. More guns equals more death. Statistically, that is true. And to presume otherwise is to fold ourselves into some pretend world where guns are glorious. You know what Jewish tradition says? Jewish tradition says, on a question in the Talmud about whether or not you're allowed to carry a weapon, a sword or a spear on Shabbat, because we don't carry on Shabbat, the way that it could be considered acceptable is if it were an adornment, as if a weapon were a piece of jewelry. And the rabbis come to a very simple conclusion about swords in the Talmud. Weapons are ugly. Weapons are not adornments, and so they cannot be carried on Shabbat. On Shabbat, a weapon was carried in. And anyone who says that there is a defense for it, a context for that, is ignoring the cold murder that leads to terrorism on behalf of an idea. Now let's ground it in the Torah portion. Last week, on that Shabbat, we read the portion that includes the binding of Isaac, where a human being felt, maybe was, called by God to commit murder. Why do we read that over and over? Is it to endorse it? God forbid. It is to challenge the notion that that is ever what God wants. God does not wish death. God does not command death. And even if you're an atheist, a fervent national supporter, meaning I believe in this vision of America, would you hurt someone in the name of your truth? If so, sacrilege, blasphemy, sin, crime, terrorism. And so we begin with a recognition that on the day where this is clearest in the Torah, that it is the anathema to God to sacrifice another human being for your idea. That is when this was done. And on a day that there was a bris happening in the synagogue, a brit, a covenant, that is when we say the language in the liturgy, Va'omar lach b'damayich chayi. That's what we say in Hebrew during a bris. And I say to you, says the prophet, through your blood shall you live. Live. Choose life. Anyone who acts otherwise is absolutely desecrating God. Anyone who acts otherwise is absolutely forgetting their humanity. And any American who does not see this as an assault on the dignity and civility and welfare of society is missing the point too. We grieve as Jews, but we also grieve as Jews when someone else is murdered. The number of images of non-Jews leaving flowers and baked goods and notes and showing up as clergy at interfaith gatherings by the thousands in these last 2 days. We show up as Jews when there is an assault on any image of God. So too have Americans and others shown up for the Jewish American community today. We are not isolated. We do not live in a ghetto. And to arm ourselves against the world is to act in trauma not with any sense. We dare not let down our guard. We dare not act as if we are isolated. We are part of the whole. A human being is a human being, and all of us are images of God. And for now, let me close with one teaching. One singular teaching. Because it is true that you can become numb. It is true that with every increasing act of gun violence and with every acceptance of it by an administration that was bought by the NRA, you can become used to this. And our response can be, oh, that hurts. All right, next. And to click away from the news or to find some way of binge watching a show that has nothing to do with the real world. We are not allowed. So I'm going to close with the teaching of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. He wrote, an individual dies when they cease to be surprised. I am surprised every morning that I see the sunshine again. When I see an act of evil, I am not accommodated. I don't accommodate myself to the violence that goes on everywhere. I'm still surprised. That's why I'm against it, why I can hope against it. We must learn how to be surprised, not to adjust ourselves. So let me bless you and me with righteous indignation, not just grief. And righteous indignation that leads to action, because the vote comes in just a week. How about you look at who's running and how they have voted when it comes to gun violence? Because I can cry my eyes out and not change the world a bit. How dare we? How dare we consider our grief enough of a response? 11 martyrs in a shul, 96 every day in America. We dare not bury our head in our hands and call that a response. On Yom Kippur, the Jewish community reads a Haftorah, a prophetic reading straight from Isaiah, where the prophet says, in the name of God, you have offered all the sacrifices you were commanded, but you call that the fast I want. God doesn't seek the perfection of sacrifice of animals. God asks us to walk humbly and save each other's lives. You see your neighbor, Jewish or not, suffering, you act. That's to be a Jew in the world. Well, America right now is your neighbor. 3 blocks away from the synagogue is where Mr. Rogers grew up, and he told us to always look for the helpers. So the blessing we offer each other is this: look in the mirror, be a helper. No one is helpless today. We are sad to our core, and we are not accommodated. So remain surprised, and get angry, and get active, and in your anger learn to love more deeply. Don't hurt anyone for your ideas either. That's the best we can do. Love more fiercely. Find neighbors who observe differently than you, who believe differently than you, and know that they are all created in the same image that you are, and no one's life is worth less. The words from the bris, I'll just close with for the final moment. Va'omar lach b'damai chayi. The prophet calls to us, live. Live. Enough blood has been spilled. Let's choose life.